If you really just want light and air, and I'll just say it, folks, don't live in New York. Get the hell out of the city. You and I are both urbanists. We love, New York City. I love the urban energy of New York. I love the density. Density means retail. It means restaurants. It means cultural events. It means meeting friends and acquaintances, running into people, this vibrant life, great universities. If you really just want light and air, and I'll just say it, folks, don't live in New York. I mean, get the hell out of the city. Honestly, this is a city for urban dwellers. And the idea of flattening out the city, not allowing skyscrapers here, to me, this is un-New York.
Welcome to Making Infrastructure Pay. I'm Kyle Kirschling, and today we're speaking again with economist Raymond Niles, and this is going to be part 3 of our series on rent control, and we're going to take your questions.
Glad to be back, Kyle. Ready to roll.
We got a lot of interesting comments and questions, and so there's sort of like 3 areas. There were a lot of questions about solutions. Like, what things can we do to get rid of rent control? How would that look? How do we make sure that there's more construction? There are questions and comments about what other cities have done. And then there were some questions that are just kind of like general economics, more straight economics related supply demand stuff. So I'm going to start with the solutions. So here, this is from Juan Pedro 6209. Great video. I do have mixed feelings on the topic. On one hand, I understand how rent regulation can strangle and decrease the quality of the housing supply, but on the other hand, getting rid of rent regulation will put many low-income people out on the streets. Many of these people can't afford a significant increase in their rents. I'm looking forward to hearing possible solutions to these problems in your future videos.
Yeah, well, I think when the problem was created by rent control in the first place, where you basically created a class of people who had very, very low below market rents, and then they become basically, stuck in those apartments. They can't move out, especially because the market rents that exist because of the constraints in the construction of new housing, the market rents, there aren't that many of market apartments, and the rents are extremely high. So they're really trapped in their very low rent apartments. So with any kind of intervention in the economy like this, when we're talking about price controls, you don't eliminate it instantly all at once. Now, you can do it for other kinds of commodities. For example, oil was decontrolled very quickly in a matter of months, and very quickly new supplies of oil were discovered and the price of gasoline went down. And people were afraid when oil was decontrolled that the prices would soar out of control. Quite the opposite happened.
This is in the 70s and the 90s?
This is in the late 1970s and early 90s. But with housing, because housing, takes a long time to construct, alternatives aren't immediately available. So, I think rent control should be phased out over some reasonable period of time, say 5 years. The city actually attempted to do that in, I think it was 1968, where they had a program called vacancy decontrol. And the idea was when the tenants just naturally move out of their apartments, the rents just go to market levels. That's a good answer. I think that's a good solution, is just when the tenants do move out, the rents go to market levels. But otherwise, what I would say is like a 5-year phase out where you'd have, say, larger increases for those 5 years. And then people have time to adjust, move to a different apartment, earn more money. The city can then benefit from having rent control go away.
So I guess you'd agree that it's for the people who are in a rent controlled apartment now, they would probably have to pay higher rents.
They're going to have to pay higher rents.
Even after a couple of years, because depending on how low their rent is.
Well, it depends.
Not everyone's going to have lower rents necessarily.
Right. So the benefit to the existing tenants is they're going to find that the landlord's going to have a greater incentive to maintain their apartments. They're going to have better heat in winter. Faster repairs to their apartments. And then what they're going to discover is that the quality of housing is just much higher. New buildings being built, with elevators rather than being stuck, living decades in a walk-up, from, that was built in the 1800s. The quality of housing would very much improve. Another solution is to sort of make it easier for landlords to buy out rent-regulated tenants. So right now in New York, if you've lived, say, 20 years or 30 years in a rent-regulated apartment, your rent effectively is much, much lower than the market rents. Now, if a landlord wants to redevelop the property, if he wants to rehab the whole building, or better yet, tear it down, tear down this 1800s 5-story walk-up, and put in a modern 10 or 15-story elevator building with amenities. If he wants to do that, he can't do it if there's even one single holdout tenant in the building and in the old building. And therefore, they can live there legally for the rest of their lives. So one thing a landlord can do today is they can buy out the tenant. But the problem is the tenant has all the cards. The tenant basically has a lifetime squatter's right to their apartment, which means they've got the landlord, to use a colorful analogy, by the gonads, basically, and they can extract any amount of money they want from the landlord. Well, instead of that, what I would propose is you have sort of by statute, a payout which is set by the government at a reasonable amount. Maybe, every year you've lived in the apartment, you get $1,000. So if you're there 20 years, you get $20,000. But the landlord can pay the money, and when your lease expires, your 1 or 2 year lease expires, they can evict you, and then they can tear down that building and modernize it. Because the tenant gets something. The tenant gets something for them to transition to find housing somewhere else.
I mean, and that seems, I guess, like the biggest injustice is if you bought a building before there was rent control and then it was enacted on top of after you bought the building, or it was made stricter after you bought the building. So I suppose it's not as unfair to ask someone who bought the building, more recently to then pay out some money.
That's right.
I mean, it's not as bad.
I mean, it's interesting in a moral sense. If you rent a property, you have a 1 or 2 year lease, morally, the landlord should be able to evict you when the 2 year lease is up. You don't own the property. But what New York City has done is they've bequeathed after the fact, essentially ownership rights on the tenants. It's very unfair to the landlords. And it's unfair to other tenants who have to pay so much more for housing because of the artificial scarcity of housing. I'll give you one example of just how unfair it can be. I know an architect who is consulting with an owner of a tenement building on the Upper West Side of Manhattan in a valuable area. And he wants to tear down the building and build a modern building. And the building he owns, he inherited it from his father, who worked very hard. I think he was like a blue-collar worker, saved up money. That building was going to be his inheritance. Well, he passed it on to his son, who wants to redevelop the building and put up a modern building there. This building dates from the 1800s, like the 1860s. It's a walk-up, ancient, 150-year-old, ramshackle tenement building. He has 2 tenants left in the building who won't move out. They said, we will move out if you give us a 1/4 equity position in the new building when you build it. There's a word for that. It's called extortion. I might have mentioned this example last time we spoke. I don't know if I did. But rent control creates all sorts of unfairness. So you got to bear this in mind when we think about, the plight of these rent-controlled tenants. And if we get rid of rent control, it's an unjust system that put them there to begin with and gave them these squatters' rights over their apartments.
Yeah, there's an injustice being done now to the owners of the building every day that we continue to.
That's right. That's right.
So I guess, what I'm hearing is that, first of all, if we get rid of rent control, rents overall are going to go down. So there would be, the people in the rent controlled apartment now would at least have better options available. It wouldn't be as expensive to move, even if they're paying more. Or you could do, as you call it, vacancy decontrol, where you say, fine, the people who are in them now can have them, but as soon as they leave, it ends, and there's no, not creating any new.
Goes to market.
Yeah, right, goes to market. You could limit or set a price for buyouts based on certain criteria.
Some kind of formula.
Right.
But where it's preset, so you can't just extort the landlord with an unlimited amount, a demand that's unreasonable.
Because that's an option.
It has to be set by the government.
Today, the landlord could do that, but the tenant could then extract basically all the profits from the venture. So in other words, all the investment, instead of going into the new building, it's going into paying the rent-controlled tenant.
Exactly.
Instead of actually building more housing.
That's right. rent control has to end. I mean, if New York is going to grow and thrive, if it's going to be a welcoming city for businesses, for newcomers, because rent control has squelched the construction of new housing, has destroyed the incentives to construct new housing, because it's led to tenants squatting in apartments, there's a dearth of apartments in New York City. And that means that the available apartments sell, if they're condos, for absurdly high prices, if there are some of the few market rentals, for absurdly high rents. And that's like a tax on growth, a tax on progress. It's a tax on that all the newcomers pay in order to entrench these existing New Yorkers. It pits the existing New Yorkers against the future New Yorkers. But, it means that the city, the economy of New York would be much more prosperous if we had market housing like so many other cities around the country. It's a real break to New York's economic growth.
And there are a lot of questions about how, I think a lot of people share this concern about, well, what about, they're worried, they see all the problems that it's having, but they're worried about the individuals who live in them now. I mean, another thing I was thinking about, you could maybe have some kind of income requirement, because as far as I know, there's no income limits to get a rent controlled apartment.
We have that right now. So that in the 1990s, there was a partial deregulation of rents, and if rents were over $2,500 a month, they were just unregulated. They could just float to market. And it's one reason why expensive rentals aren't that hard to find, because essentially it's almost a free market for only the very, very expensive rentals. But the other thing they did is they put in an income test and said, if you make more than a certain amount of money, your apartment, it will no longer be subject to rent regulation. So the example would be like, if you're, living on Park Avenue, you're paying $2,000 a month for, an 8-bedroom apartment that would rent, the market rent would be $20,000 a month. And if you're making over whatever the income threshold was, it was something like $150,000 or $200,000, rent control goes away. It's not such a good solution, because it's how does a landlord prove the income of a tenant? It becomes very, very difficult. So I think it's basically on the books now, but effectively it's very, very difficult for a landlord to establish that a tenant is making more than a certain amount of money. And the other thing I would just say is that the system is, rent control has to end. And, if we have like a system of no rent control for the wealthier people, what it really means is we're going to have a robust housing market for the rich, and the poor are still going to be stuck in this rent control system where you can't find apartments, where they're not being maintained. And
so I guess what I'm hearing is that, I mean, there are different, if you're really worried about certain individuals, there are ways that you could try to compensate them, or although it'd be more complicated, make exceptions. I don't know, this would be legal to say, like, if you're over a certain age or something, if you're over 65.
We have that as well. So part of that reform said the strictest form of rent. So that New York City, I use the term rent control as a generic term for rent regulation. But New York City in particular, rent control refers to the most severe form of rent regulation, where rents either don't rise at all, or they rise lower rate than the rate of inflation. Then there's rent stabilization, which came in later on in 1971, which allows rents to rise at a faster rate. Very few apartments are still left under rent control. But the way that rent stabilization was written, they said, well, if you're over age 65, then you can ask for an exemption from your rents increasing. So basically the bottom line is the rental market in New York is so regulated. The rules are so arcane, so complicated. I mean, there's a whole industry of lawyers, where landlords and tenants are constantly fighting with each other. Landlords want to do everything they can to raise the rent. So for example, you can't legally have 2 rent regulated apartments. You can't, you can only have one. It has to be a primary residence. But it happens all the time where I rented an apartment from a woman who, she made money by illegally subleasing her rent regulated apartment. So her rent was way below market. She would charge a market rent. She could pocket the money and she lived somewhere else. That's illegal. But how do you prove it? How does the landlord prove it? So instead of the money going to the landlord so you could invest in new buildings that New Yorkers need, the money goes into the pockets of the tenant who siphons it away from the landlord. But it's a very confusing mess. I mean, as an economist, I would say the whole thing's got to go. Lock, stock, and barrel. There are humane ways to have a transition, but we need a transition with dates certain. I would say like 5 years. It's over in 5 years. You have 5 years to find a new apartment. You can have a transition period. You can get a lump sum payment. As an economist, those details matter to me less. I think if there was the political will to end rent control, believe me, we'd figure out ways of ending it.
Yeah, right. That's a good one. There are a lot of different things you could do to address the particular cases of certain people. But even
it's got to go. You can't have exemptions for old people or people with lower incomes. You know, it has to end for everyone to have a vibrant, robust housing market. We need a free market in housing.
Right.
You know, when we had a free market in housing, so New York City experienced the largest immigrant wave in modern human history. Millions of immigrants coursed through New York, you know, coming to America, the land of freedom. And guess where most of them settled before maybe they moved to other parts of the country? The Lower East Side. I live in the Lower East Side right now. In the early 1900s, the Lower East Side was the densest point of land on Earth, meaning the largest number of people per acre on planet Earth. All of those people were housed without a nickel of government money because there was no rent regulation. Profit-seeking landlords built those acres and acres of tenements, which are actually modern housing of that day, of the late 19th century. The idea of these multi-unit tenement housing was an innovation for its day. We can look at it today. It's a fallacy, like to look at today's standards with air conditioning and elevators and indoor plumbing and say, oh, those tenements weren't great. Well, that's ridiculous. That's like saying, you know, we look at today's modern jet travel and say, how did people travel in stagecoaches? Well, they didn't have jet airplanes. Back then it was state-of-the-art housing. And what's sad, so it was all built without a nickel of subsidy, no public housing, and it was all done through the free market. The free market responds to that supply and demand. If there's a demand for housing, even millions of people can be housed with low-cost housing if the government gets out of the way. Now, New York City has other obstacles, but the biggest obstacle we have is rent control. Rent control destroys the incentive of an entrepreneur to build rental housing. Why would you build rental housing in a market where the government's going to set the rent? And where eventually, if they don't like loosen the rent regulations, as we saw in the 1970s and 80s, acres and acres of New York City became abandoned wastelands when the landlords walked away from their buildings when they became unprofitable. Who's going to invest in a situation like that where that threat hangs over the market? So if we want a robust housing market of available, cheap, low-cost housing, just like we house those millions of immigrants, the government needs to let the housing market work, and they need to get rid of rent control. So that's my speech on rent control. But
that's what we're here for. Your speech on rent control. And I guess too that I suppose it's important to keep in mind that the more you dilute the deregulation, the more exceptions we make, the less the fewer improvements will be in the quality of housing, the less new construction there will be, the less rents will fall overall. We're diluting the benefits of
that's right. The more you hamstring the market. You know, imagine an Olympic swimmer and you've tied one hand around his back and you throw him in the water and you say, he's swimming so slowly, he can't break his record. Now, how about if you tie two hands around his back? He just has his feet. How about if you tie two hands around his back and he has, in one of his legs, you hobble, right? It's the same principle in markets. The more restrictions, the more you get in the way of the profit motive, the incentive of businesses to produce goods and services for profit, the more you restrict it, the less you're going to have of that good. It's as simple as that. So any form of restriction. I mean, if we say there's a rent board, they may increase the rents, but it's up to them. And sometimes politically, it'll be more than the rate of inflation. Sometimes it'll be less than the rate of inflation. Well, that's better than strict rent control where rents don't go up at all, which means in real terms, with inflation, rents are declining. That's what led to the abandonments in the 70s and 90s. But any restriction means less investment in the market. Landlords, an investor does not have to invest in a particular business enterprise, and they're going to go where the greatest profits are. And if they have a city without rent regulation versus New York with rent regulation, where are they going to go? So any restriction restricts the flow of investment in housing. We want more investment in housing. That's what we want.
Now, I was watching a video, Richard Wolff. He's, I think, a Marxist economist, but he basically agree with, I think, your points about how rent control is harmful, how it reduces the incentive to build new housing, it increases the demand, so you have this huge mismatch, and you don't and you have a shortage. It creates a shortage.
Right.
But he then went on to say, well, just build public housing. That would be the answer.
Well, go check out the public housing. First of all, I don't know if you or I would even want to walk into a public housing project because it's a lot safer than it used to be, but the crime is absurd. People urinate in the elevators. The elevators don't work. I mean, they're horror stories. Public housing is an abomination. Everyone knows it, right? So to pretend that public housing is the solution is to imagine that the government will be a better landlord than a for-profit landlord. The government has no profit motive. Government official gets no reward for getting it right. They get no punishment for getting it wrong. Right? I mean, like imagine, this manufacturer who made my suit jacket, if they just sell it and it's not the right color that people like, they go to business. If it's not sewn right, they go to business. And imagine if the government was making this suit, what would the suit jacket look like? It would be awful. They have no competition. Public housing is not an answer. And because the government is building it, it's incredibly expensive. I think I saw a statistic, it was a while ago that said the cost per square foot of public housing was 6 times what it costs to build private housing. So what you're really saying is we're going to impoverish all of us through super high taxes to pay for this god-awful public housing. And it's ugly. Public housing is an eyesore because they have no incentive even to make it aesthetically appealing. New York City, our public housing, I actually traveled when I was a kid and went to East Berlin before the wall fell and saw East Germany. And New York City housing looks exactly like the communist housing built in East Berlin. It's not a solution. It's not a solution. It's too expensive. These are quality is terrible. It costs too much.
Yeah, they are very, I mean, you see, like, at least in New York City, when you see those buildings, especially at night, and just like in the windows, a lot of them are broken, and there's a lot of garbage in the courtyards. And I understand they are better than they used to be, but I don't think people would.
Government run enterprises of any form are terrible. Look at the Postal Service. I mean, are they polite to you when you go there? They're rude because you're not a customer. You're a pain in the butt. If you're managing a public housing project, you have any incentive to provide a good quality experience to your tenants. Now, it's interesting, in private housing, rent control kind of converts housing, in a sense, into public housing in terms of the incentives of the landlords.
It's kind of fascist.
Because a landlord has, they don't profit by creating a good experience for the tenant because the tenant gets locked in there and the rents keep falling, relative to market. There's no incentive to offer a good experience to tenants in a rent controlled environment.
Yeah, the only way to, I guess, make money is to give poorer service in a sense, or cheaper.
That's right.
Service. Now there was another question about the solution, and saying I agree that the solution to the crisis is more supply. My problem is that proponents of housing abundance have not been able to affect substantial amounts of new housing supply. This is likely because of lacking political will and worry about backlash. But I think they're pointing out that, like, some of the efforts that have been going on now, like the City of Yes, and I think they're concerned that is this really going to make that much difference? Getting rid of rent? Are we going to actually notice it, or is it going to are people going to say this is a failure because the rents haven't changed?
I think I hear what they're saying is that, politically, so I would call maybe this whole desire to eliminate rent control as part of a broader program of housing deregulation, like reforming the zoning laws, get rid of zoning, allow denser construction. We want an abundant supply of new housing that will bring down costs. So, that will bring down costs. But I think what this critic is saying is that politically, this sort of city of yes, or YIMBY, yes in my backyard, movement hasn't achieved a lot. And I would just say, yeah, we got to fight harder.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like whatever we can do is good.
Yeah.
So to any degree, you can reform the laws, make it less stringent. I mean, the analogy I use with rent control is imagine, and this is a pretty gruesome analogy, but imagine someone puts a noose around your neck and you're standing on a rickety stool, and every time it leans, you start to go, you start choking. Well, if you start to choke, if they loosen the noose, you can breathe. And in a way, we've seen progressive loosenings of rent control since the 1940s when it was imposed in New York. And if we didn't loosen it to the degree we have, we would be even worse shape than what
the Bronx is an example of them dying. They didn't loosen it, and they just died.
That's right. South Bronx, Harlem, Lower East Side, East Village, Brownsville, Bedford-Stuyvesant, acres and acres and acres of New York, which were abandoned and became abandoned wastelands when strict rent control stayed in place, so that with inflation, real rents are declining. Meanwhile, costs are unregulated. Your fuel oil, your superintendent, your cost of repairs. And think about it. If you're operating a business and your costs begin to exceed your revenues, and as soon as it becomes cash flow negative, and if you can do nothing to reverse it, you have to walk away from your property. So acres of New York were abandoned by their landlords. Now, you can't evict the tenants. You can't get them out. You can't raise their rents to market levels. If you just raise the rents to market levels, that building could stay in existence. This is one of the reasons that in the 90s, they loosened the rent laws. They said rents over $2,500 are decontrolled. Thankfully, that brought in a lot of new investment into the city. And now, we're in a new period of stringency in the housing market in New York. And guess what? When Mayor de Blasio re-tightened the noose in, I forget, like 2019 or something like that, he re-tightened the noose. He eliminated the ability to increase rents when tenants leave. He made it more difficult to raise rents if you upgrade and rehab a building. Well, guess what that meant was landlords are no longer going to rehab and upgrade their buildings. And so the supply of new housing got choked off. So I would attribute our recent increased stringency in the rental market, where market rents are even higher than they were before. I would attribute it to the tightening of the noose of rent regulation under Mayor de Blasio. But, the fact that we don't have wholesale abandonments anymore of buildings was because of the loosening of the laws in the 90s. But, I guess that's a very long way of saying any loosening is good. But the best solution is to eliminate it all the way. But let's do everything we can. I'll take whatever deregulation we can get.
So then I think it's important that they understand that the smaller changes are not going to have, they're going to have smaller effects.
Exactly.
Because I'm concerned that we might take little steps and people will say, well, it didn't do anything. So therefore, maybe we need rent control or we need these regulations. But if people understand, look, every little bit helps, but it's only going to help a little bit.
That's right.
If you get rid of all rent control and probably zoning, at least the bulk requirements.
That's right.
I mean, that almost certainly would have huge increase in the housing supply. And with the rent control, the nice thing is it would happen very quickly.
It would happen very quickly. We'd see such a flood of new construction. It would be unbelievable. But we also do need to address zoning. So 1916, New York was the first pretty much city in the world that established a comprehensive program of restricting the size of new buildings. And they did it because they said, we want to preserve light and air for, pedestrians, people walking on the streets of New York. That's true. You get the light and the air, but what you're doing is you're restricting the construction of new housing, and what that does is that makes housing more expensive. And over the years, the zoning laws have gotten stricter and stricter and stricter. So, to the point where what I read is that if you look at many of today's, especially the older buildings, the ones built before 1916 or maybe under the earlier zoning laws, 40% of all of New York City's buildings are illegal. They're illegal under today's zoning laws. What do you do? Tear them down? I mean, go to the West Village. You'll see a 12-story building on the West Village. You cannot build a 12-story building in that neighborhood anymore. Maybe you could build, seriously, a 4, 5, or 6-story building. Go to Queens. You'll see all these old these older 8-story buildings or 10-story buildings, but now today you can only build a 4 or 5-story building there. This creates a pressure on rents. This creates a pressure on condo prices. So we'd want to get rid of rent control, and that would still lead to new construction, even within the constraints of our current zoning system.
Right.
But you're still not going to get to that scenario like you would where, like we had, say, in the early 1900s, where millions of immigrants could be housed with low cost, inexpensive housing. We could have that in New York. There's plenty of room to build. People say there's not enough room to build. Well, if you flattened out all of Manhattan, this is another thing that I saw. If you flattened out all of New York City, you would smush it to be like the equivalent of 1 2-story building. Like all those 80-story skyscrapers, smush them down, and you flatten New York to be a 2-story building. There's plenty of room to build up. There's plenty of room to build up.
If you covered the entire surface area of Manhattan with housing, taking as though they were like a Minecraft, they would be equivalent of 1 or 2 stories.
That's right.
Overall, yeah. Whereas someplace like Hong Kong, I think it's much higher. The floor area ratio is much.
Correct.
So it's actually not as dense as it seems. Some parts are very dense.
Right. Density's declined. Density's declined in Manhattan compared to what it was 80 years ago.
Yeah.
So there are fewer people per square mile living all over New York. And yeah, we're way less dense in Hong Kong than a lot of cities around the world. And, you and I are both urbanists. We love, New York City. I mean, New York City is, what is it? 1/10,000th of 1% of the surface area of the United States. I love the urban energy of New York. I love the density. Density means retail. It means restaurants. It means cultural events. It means meeting friends and acquaintances, running into people, this vibrant life, great universities. If you really just want light and air, and I'll just say it, folks, don't live in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, get the hell out of the city. Honestly, this is a city for urban dwellers. And the idea of flattening out the city, not allowing skyscrapers here, to me, this is un-New York. I think it's just, you're not a New Yorker if you want that. Now, what there's a phenomenon, though, with zoning, which is what we see, is that people can live in their own 20-story building, but they don't want their views blocked. Or they live in their own 10-story building, so they don't want any new buildings to go up around them. Is that right? Is that moral? Right? I've got my good situation, none for you, none for the newcomers. And we see this with zoning, keeping out the newcomers, keeping out the riffraff. We see this with rent control. I'm in my rent-regulated apartment, subsidized by my neighbors, paying higher rents around me. But, I don't want my rent to go up and let the newcomers pay higher rents. So I don't think it's right.
One thing that I liked, if I understood him correctly, Nick Steffen made a comment. So I think he's basically at the view that the zoning is more significant, but he was saying, but if you also get rid of rent control, that would be like an advertisement, like saying open for business. You know what I mean? It was like a way to really almost symbolize the fact that we've changed. We want investment. We want growth. Not only that with the zoning, but also, it's like, look, you can charge what you want. Come to New York City, build housing, make money.
I love it. Open for business.
Yeah.
I can get behind that.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, that's all we have time for today. So thanks for joining me, Ray.
Thanks. My pleasure, Kyle. It was
Okay.
enjoyable as always.
And so next time, well, first of all, like and subscribe if you enjoy the content. And next time, we're going to talk about some things that are happening in other cities and just some more general economics issues. That's it. Thanks.